The ice doesn't give up its dead easily, but sometimes, decades later, it whispers, a skull half buried in gravel on a windswept island, beside it a knife, and on the bones marks, thin, deliberate cuts, the kind made by men who had run out of every other choice. Imagine you are the last one alive. The ships are gone. The captain is dead. There is no rescue coming, and the only thing standing between you and the end is the body of the man who died yesterday. This is the story history tried to forget, and it begins in 1845. It was May 1845. England was proud, confident, certain of its place at the center of the world, and it sent two of its finest ships into the unknown to prove it. HMS Erebus, HMS Terror, names that sound, in hindsight, like a warning nobody chose to read. At their head was Captain Sir John Franklin, 60 years old, a veteran of the Arctic. Man who had survived a previous expedition so brutal he became known as the man who ate his boots. Behind him stood 128 officers and men, 129 souls in total. The mission was simple on paper: traverse the final unnavigated stretch of the Northwest Passage, the frozen sea route threading through the Canadian Arctic, record magnetic data, map the empty white places no European had charted, then come home as heroes. They were equipped for years. Tons of preserved food, books, fine china, a library, everything a civilized expedition could need. In July 1845, a whaling ship spotted Erebus and Terror moored to an iceberg in Baffin Bay. The crews waved, the sails were full. The men looked healthy, eager, alive. That was the last time anyone outside the expedition would ever see them breathing. They sailed west into the white, and the white closed behind them like a door. No letters, no signals, no sign at all. For 3 years, England waited, and the Arctic kept its secret. Here is the detail that stops people cold. They didn't all die quickly. We imagined disaster as something sudden. A crash, a storm, a single terrible moment. But what happened to Franklin's men was the opposite. It was slow. The ships became trapped in the pack ice near King William Island, in what is today the Canadian territory of Nunavut. Not for a day, not for a week. For more than a year, Erebus and Terror sat locked in the frozen sea, unable to move an inch in any direction. The ice held them like a fist, and inside that fist, the men began to die, one by one. By April 1848, 24 were already gone, including Franklin himself, the captain who had survived so much, dead on the ice, the exact circumstances unknown to this day. The survivors were now led by Franklin's second-in-command, Francis Crozier, and the captain of the Erebus, James Fitzjames. They made a decision. They abandoned both ships. Imagine that moment. You step off the only shelter you have left, onto open ice, with the nearest human settlement hundreds of miles away across a frozen wasteland. You are weak, you are cold, you are starving, and you start walking toward the Canadian mainland, toward survival. Crozier led them south. And then nothing, no trail, no bodies, no record. The entire surviving expedition simply vanished off the face of the earth. Every disappearance has someone who refuses to let it end. For Franklin's lost expedition, that person was a woman, Jane, Lady Jane Franklin, the captain's wife. While the Admiralty hesitated, while the bureaucrats debated whether the men might simply be delayed, Jane Franklin pushed, and refused to be quiet. In 1848, pressured by Jane and others who would not accept silence, the Admiralty finally launched a search. It would become one of the largest search efforts in history. Ships sailed north, then more ships. Years passed, and still she pushed, funding expeditions herself, writing letters, refusing the word everyone wanted her to accept. Dead. Think about that for a moment. There is something about a disappearance that does this to the people left behind. It is not the same as grief. Grief has an end, a disappearance does not. It is a wound that never closes because there is always one more question, one more search, one more reason to hope. We see it still today. In 2024, a Michigan woman named Lynette Hooker vanished in the Bahamas. Her husband, Brian Hooker, said she fell overboard from a dinghy. A recovery mission launched. He was arrested, then released without charges, and the questions remained hanging in the air unanswered. The technology changes, the century changes, but the agony of not knowing, that never changes at all. The searches went on for decades, and slowly the Arctic began to give back its secrets piece by terrible piece. Artifacts surfaced, tools, equipment, personal belongings scattered across the frozen ground as if dropped by men who could no longer carry them. And then the remains. The bodies of two men were eventually recovered and returned to Britain, buried at last, far from the ice that killed them. But it was what a searcher named John Ray learned in 1854 that changed everything. Ray spoke to the Inuit who lived in that unforgiving land, people who knew the ice, who knew survival, who had no reason to lie. And they told him a story so disturbing that Victorian England recoiled in horror and tried to bury it. The men of the Franklin expedition, in their final desperate days, had resorted to cannibalism. The proud sailors of the British Empire, reduced to the unthinkable, the public refused to believe it. Charles Dickens himself wrote furiously against the idea, insisting Englishmen would never do such a thing. The Inuit, he implied, were lying. They were not lying. And more than a century later, science would prove it beyond any doubt. But that proof, the proof carved into human bone, would not surface until modern times. And when it did, it confirmed the very worst of what those final months had become. In modern times, scientists returned to those scattered remains with tools the Victorians never had. They examined the bones recovered across King William Island and the surrounding land, and what they found settled the argument forever. Cut marks, thin, deliberate incisions on the bones, the unmistakable signature of defleshing, of human bodies being cut apart by other human beings. Inuit accounts had been true all along, but the bones told an even larger story. The men hadn't died of one thing, they had died of everything. Hypothermia as the cold seeped into them, starvation as the food ran out, scurvy as their bodies broke down from the inside, and something stranger, lead poisoning, possibly from the very tins of food meant to keep them alive, or zinc deficiency that left them weak and confused. Picture it, men slowly losing their minds, their judgment failing. Their bodies wasting away in clothing never meant for such cold, walking in circles, collapsing in the snow, each death making the next one more likely. This was not a quick disaster. It was a long, agonizing unraveling that lasted years after that whaling ship last saw them, healthy and waving, in July 1845. Every single one of the 129 men died. Not one survived to tell the story themselves. The ice took them all. And it would be more than 150 years before anyone even found the ships. For over a century and a half, the two ships were simply gone. Erebus and Terror, swallowed whole. Generations of searchers came and went, and the ships stayed hidden somewhere beneath the cold, dark water of the Canadian Arctic. People began to wonder if they would ever be found at all. Then, in the modern era, they were, first one, then the other. Discovered resting on the seafloor, remarkably preserved by the frigid water, ghost ships sitting upright in the gloom, their decks intact, their interiors frozen in the moment they were lost. Imagine a diver descending into that darkness, the water so cold it bites through every layer. And then out of the blackness, a wooden hull, a railing, a doorway leading into rooms that no living person has entered in nearly 200 years, plates still stacked, personal items still in place. A time capsule of the moment everything went wrong. The discovery answered some questions. The ships had drifted from where they were abandoned, suggesting some men may have returned to them, tried to sail them, tried one last desperate gamble to survive. But for every answer the ships gave, they raised new questions. Who came back, when, and what did they hope to find in those frozen, lightless rooms? The expedition did, in the end, succeed at one thing. It helped chart the vicinity of one of the Northwest Passages that would later be navigated. A victory written entirely in the dead. Here is what stays with me about Franklin's lost expedition. It is not the cold, it is not even the cannibalism. It is the shape of the thing. A disappearance has a particular gravity. It pulls at us in a way that simple death never does. Because somewhere in the back of the mind, a voice keeps asking, what if? What if they survived a little longer than we thought? What if one more search would find the answer? What if the truth is still out there, waiting in the snow, or under the water, or in a story no one has thought to believe yet? The Franklin men have been gone for nearly 180 years, and we are still pulling answers out of the ice, still finding bones, still finding ships, still rewriting what we thought we knew. And the same hunger drives the searches of today. When Lynette Hooker vanished from a dinghy in the Bahamas in 2024, the recovery mission launched immediately. Her husband arrested, then released without charges, saying he wanted to help search. A modern mystery with no resolution yet. Different century, same ache. The truth is, the world is full of people who walked into the white and never came back. Some of them we eventually find, most of them we never do. And the ones we do find, sometimes the truth they carry is worse than the not knowing ever was. 129 men sailed into the white and vanished. It took nearly 2 centuries to begin to understand why. And somewhere out there tonight, someone else is missing, and someone who loves them refuses to stop searching. What do you think really happened in those final months on the ice? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if the silence of the lost stays with you the way it stays with me, subscribe to the Obscura Files. There are more disappearances waiting in the dark.